Please welcome Dr. Ryken.
Thank you. Thank you. The classics as enlightened leisure, Dickens' Great Expectation. The Roman author Horace, writing on the function of literature 20 years before the birth of Jesus, bequeathed a formula that has stood the test of time. Horace claimed that literature combines what is dulce with what is utile. In the circles in which I move, the utile seems to trump the dulce by a wide margin. I remember my very first class session as a teacher of literature at Wheaton College. I had prepared a lecture on literary theory that developed a Christian defense of literature and some rudiments of a methodology for reading literature self-consciously as Christian readers. I remember that my students stared at me passively as I talked about the pleasures of literature. Then when I put the word useful on the table, bodies sat up and pens suddenly hit the paper of the notebooks. It was a knee-jerk response that said, "We want what is useful." I propose to do three things in this address. Although I will speak as a teacher of literature, the carryover to other spheres should be easy to make. The first task I've set for myself is to make the argument for the importance of pleasure and our assimilation of literature and the arts, and the liberal arts more generally. Then I will take a brief excursion into the biblical endorsement of pleasure and enjoyment. Thirdly, I will apply the foregoing by talking about the forms of pleasure that Charles Dickens' novel Great Expectations offers to us. As an epigraph for my address, I've chosen the following statement by C.S. Lewis. Every good book should be entertaining. A good book will be more, it must not be less. Every episode, explanation, description, dialogue, ideally every sentence, must be pleasurable for its own sake. First then, my hedonistic defense of literature based on the pleasure principle. The best starting point for getting an angle on the pleasure-giving aspect of literature is not to theorize about it, but to proceed empirically, simply observing what happens when we read, hear, or view literature, and correspondingly why we seek out literary occasions. One of the oldest accounts of how people actually experience literature can be found in the passage in Homer's Odyssey that describes the performance of epic. Here's one of those descriptions. "What a pleasure it is, my lord," Odysseus said, "to hear a singer like this with a divine voice. I declare it is just the perfection of gracious life. Good cheer and good temper everywhere, rows of guests enjoying themselves heartily and listening to the music, plenty to eat on the table, wine ready in the great bowl, and the butler ready to fill your cup whenever you want it. I think that is the best thing men can have." Obviously, the performance of an epic was a form of after-dinner entertainment. Its function was communal enjoyment in a courtly setting. In fact, the regularity with which epics were performed when visiting dignitaries arrived suggests that it was a preeminent form of entertainment in ancient societies. To say that the most apparent function of an epic recital was entertainment is not to preclude the possibility that epic might have also served a didactic function. Obviously, though, people did not attend the performance of an epic in the spirit and with the expectations that we bring to hearing a sermon or attending a lecture. They first of all expected to be entertained. It is an easy step from the after-dinner epic performance in Homer's Odyssey to our own experiences as readers of literature. While readers gravitate to literature for many reasons, enjoyment or pleasure is nearly always the leading motivation. Literature is something we pursue in our leisure time. While we also do utilitarian things in our free time, there are reasons for assigning reading a story or attending a play or reading a poem to the category of entertainment. Reading a novel is felt by most readers to have more in common with a stroll in the park than studying a textbook, and more in common with going on vacation than working in the kitchen or office. Watching a play is closer to attending a ball game than listening to a lecture. We can learn a lot about the nature of literature by paying attention to what prompts people to seek literature in the first place. The overwhelming majority of people, not counting those who are enrolled in a literature course or wish to impress a friend, go to literature for enjoyment, entertainment, and what we might call the refreshment value of literature. People read literature because they want to, not because they are required to do so. We can also profitably notice when people read literature or go to see a play. They do so during their leisure time, in the evening, on the weekend, during a break from work, while on vacation. Even our posture and surroundings are typically relaxed when we read literature. We might normally read a textbook or an owner's manual at a desk or table, but we probably read a novel or short story in an easy chair. If we turn from these considerations of why, when, and how we typically read imaginative literature to its effects, the pleasure principle again emerges as important. The works that we finish reading and later reread obviously strike us as pleasurable. The delight and appeal of stories, for example, is well known. One of the most universal human impulses can be summed up in the 4 words, "Tell me a story." It is no wonder that Sir Philip Sidney described the storyteller as someone with the enchanting power to hold, and I quote, "children from play and old men from the chimney corner." In a similar vein, Owen Barfield, in speaking of the pleasures of poetry, describes, quote, "the old authentic thrill which is so strong that it binds some people to their libraries for a lifetime." I remember how liberating I found a comment by Charles Williams that Paradise Lost is much more fun written in blank verse than it would be in prose. Let us have all the delights of which we are capable. The nature of literature. It is easy to see why readers find literature a source of enjoyment and refreshment. These effects are rooted in the nature of literature itself. Literature is an art form, a craft or skill. Robert Frost called poetry a performance in words. Great literature pleases and awes us with its display of literary form, technique, and inventiveness. A literary scholar who surveyed the 3 areas in which modern criticism has found the value of literature identified one of the areas as, quote, "a group of closely related ideas about form, treated as a function of the imagination, beauty, form, art, style, craftsmanship, structure, the perfect and isolated object." The testimony of writers. Readers and viewers want literature to be an enjoyable use of leisure time. The nature of literature explains why literature lends itself to enjoyment and entertainment. To these 2 considerations, we can add the testimony of writers. T.S. Eliot, for example, called literature superior amusement. Jean-Paul Sartre theorized that the writer, like all other artists, aims at giving his reader aesthetic joy. Horace wrote, "That is how it is with poetry, created and developed to give joy to human hearts." Matthew Arnold said regarding poetry that it is demanded not only that it shall interest, but also that it shall inspirit and rejoice the reader, that it shall infuse delight. When writers make statements about the craft of their writing, they are giving implicit testimony to their desire that their work be a delight to their audience. Dylan Thomas, for example, claimed, "I like to treat words as a craftsman does his wood or stone, to hew, carve, mold, coil, polish, and plane them into patterns, sequences, sculptures, fugues of sound. I myself do not read poetry for anything but pleasure." Gerard Manley Hopkins claimed that the form of a poem exists for its own sake and interest, even over and above its interest of meaning. Flannery O'Connor records in her book Mystery and Manners that when a student wrote to her asking what enlightenment O'Connor expected her to get from her stories, O'Connor, quote, "wrote her back to forget about the enlightenment and just try to enjoy them." Even so obviously a didactic poet as William Wordsworth surprises us by saying that, quote, "the poet writes under one restriction only, namely, the necessity of giving immediate pleasure." Writers do not, of course, claim that literature is only entertaining, nor should I be understood as making that claim. Robert Frost expressed the majority viewpoint when he wrote that a poem begins in delight and ends in wisdom. It begins in delight and ends in a clarification of life. The useful and entertaining functions of literature are complementary, not incompatible. Point number 1, the experience of readers and viewers of literature, the nature of literature itself, the testimony of writers, all confirm the importance of pleasure and enjoyment in the literary enterprise. Point number 2, Christian hedonism. I have thus far implicitly defended the pleasures of literature on broadly humanistic grounds. Does the Christian faith have anything distinctive to say on the matter? It does. A person with a Christian worldview has a reason to value enjoyment and the enlightened use of leisure time in a way that the human race at large does not. I'm just going to theorize. Christians are the last people in the world who should feel guilty about the enjoyment of literature. As C.S. Lewis correctly stated, the Christian has no objection to comedies that merely amuse and tales that merely refresh. We can play as we can eat to the glory of God. If we are looking for a biblical endorsement of enjoyment and pleasure, the doctrine of creation is a good starting place. Christians affirm in their creed that God is maker of heaven and earth. The Bible tells us, moreover, that people are created in the image or likeness of God. Abraham Kuyper concluded from this that as image bearer of God, man possesses the possibility both to create something beautiful and to delight in it. As image bearer of God, man possesses the possibility both to create something beautiful and to delight in it. We should also note the precise kind of world that God created. He made a world that is beautiful as well as functional. Genesis 2:9, every tree that is pleasant to the sight and good for food. From a utilitarian point of view, God did not need to create a world filled with colors and beautiful shapes that delight the human senses. He could have created everything in a drab gray color. It is obvious that God made provision for the quality of human life, not simply its survival. At the heart of God's creation lies the pleasure principle, as John Piper has documented in 2 books with the intriguing titles Desiring God, Meditations of a Christian Hedonist, and The Pleasures of God, Meditations on God's Delight in Being God. While the pleasures of literature are not solely the domain of beauty, it is this aspect of literature, however we name it, that is the particular locus of the pleasure that literature offers to us. In a host of ways, not least of which is the example of the Bible itself, the Bible shows us that God values beauty. The classic texts are the passages in Exodus 35 through 39 that describe the building of the tabernacle. We read here that it was God himself who called the chief artist and, quote, filled him with the Spirit of God, with ability, with intelligence, with knowledge, and with all work in gold and silver and bronze, in cutting stones for setting and in carving wood, for work in every skilled craft. As with beauty, so with pleasure itself. Pleasure and its synonyms are one of the recurrent motifs in the Psalms, but the endorsement of pleasure is evident in less obvious ways in virtually every part of the Bible. As the article on pleasure in a dictionary of biblical imagery traces the pleasure motif in the Bible, it turns out that the Bible's positive pleasures extend to virtually every area of life: nature, worship, romantic love, family life, community and sociability, God himself. In fact, the Bible is enveloped with the pleasure principle, beginning as it does with a perfect garden and ending with an eternal life of bliss in a celestial city. The locus classicus for the biblical endorsement of pleasure is the God-centered passages in the book of Ecclesiastes. One of these passages states, "Behold, what I have seen to be good and to be fitting is to eat and drink and find enjoyment in all the toil with which one toils under the sun, the few days of his life which God has given him, for this is his lot. Every man also to whom God has given wealth and possessions and power to enjoy them, and to accept his lot and find enjoyment in his toil, this is the gift of God." These same sentiments are reiterated in a classic New Testament passage in which Paul comments on wealthy people. Paul's advice to Timothy is as follows: "Charge them that are rich in this world, that they be not high-minded, nor trust in uncertain riches, but in the living God, who giveth us richly all things to enjoy." Richly all things to enjoy. This key verse establishes 3 important principles regarding enjoyment. 1, God is the giver of all good things. 2, he gives people these things to enjoy. And 3, the misuse of them consists not in enjoyment of them, but in trusting them or making idols of them. What does the biblical affirmation of beauty and enjoyment have to do with the reading and production of literature? Primarily, it validates the enjoyment of literature as a Christian activity. When we enjoy the beauty of a sonnet, or the artistry of an epic, or the fictional inventiveness of a novel, we are enjoying a quality of which God is the ultimate source and performing an act similar to God's enjoyment of his own creation. So to the question, how can we create and read literature to the glory of God? One good answer is by enthusiastically enjoying the artistry of the literature that we create or read, recognizing God as the ultimate source of the beauty that we enjoy. The way to show gratitude for a gift is to enjoy it. Amen. Literature and art are God's gifts to the human race. One of the liberating effects of letting ourselves go as we enjoy literature is to realize that we can partly affirm the value of literature whose content or worldview we dislike. If God is the ultimate source of all beauty and artistry, then the artistic dimension of literature is the point at which Christians can be unreserved in their enthusiasm for the works of non-Christian writers. John Milton gradually came to deplore the ethical viewpoint of pagan authors, but he notes that, quote, their art I still applauded. Werner Jaeger, in his book on the classical tradition, claimed that, quote, it was the Christians who finally taught people to appraise poetry by an aesthetic standard, a standard which enabled them to reject most of the moral and religious teaching of the classical poets as false and ungodly, while accepting the formal elements in their work as instructive and aesthetically delightful. To sum up, if we look within the human spirit as created by God, we find a hunger for human creativity, for artistry, for beauty, for enjoyment. Literature and the arts are among the things that can satisfy the human urge for enjoyment. Enjoyment of beauty, of truth, of life itself. Writers aim to please as well as to edify, and they construct their works accordingly. The result is that for both writers and readers, literature is, in the words of Horace, created and developed to give joy to human hearts. My heart also soars when I read Matthew Arnold's claim that literature possesses the power to inspirit and rejoice the reader and infuse delight. The foregoing has been the theoretic half of my lecture on literature and the arts, and by extension all of the liberal arts, as enjoyment. But this conference is not about literary theory. It is partly about teaching the classics. So I want to sketch what the hedonistic defense of literature looks like when we apply what I have said to a work that lends itself to enjoyment and entertainment. For me, Charles Dickens' novel Great Expectations is what I call the archetypal fun read. In the material that I'm about to share with you, the packaging of it comes from one of my books, but that version of the material in turn came straight from my classroom presentations, in which I attempt to relive the things that make Great Expectations an entertaining experience. I should also note that while my subject in this address is the entertainment value of Great Expectations, I also relish and talk about its edification when I teach the book. A liberal arts education should bring pleasure into a person's life in addition to its practical benefits. I'm fond of a statement that Luther made in his sermon on keeping children in school. Luther spoke of the pure pleasure a person gets from being liberally educated. As I take up the subject of levels of pleasure and Great Expectations, I will begin by stating the 4 subpoints into which I break the overall subject. The levels of pleasure and Great Expectations include the following: Dickens' expertise at world making, the pleasures of plot, the pleasures of characterization, the pleasures of style and technique, including the subtlety of Dickens' humor. If I gave you all that I have composed, my remarks would take twice as long as I have time for. I intend to treat world-making in a curtailed manner. I will merely list the things that make up the pleasures of plot. I will give characterization a full treatment, and I will explore style and technique in somewhat abbreviated manner. Number 1, once upon a time, reading as escape and the pleasures of entering imagined worlds. The appeal of reading literature is based ultimately on the pleasure of being transported from one's immediate physical surroundings to a world merely imagined. We undertake reading in a holiday spirit. The prerequisite to such transport is an attitude of leave-taking from the world of ordinary responsibilities. The very attention that reading demands of us ensures that a relinquishing of ordinary concerns will happen. Self-forgetfulness is an essential ingredient of our best reading experiences. We are willing to let go like this only if the world of the imagination that beckons us is sufficiently alluring, compelling, and irresistible. That is why the opening paragraph and even the opening sentence or line of a story is so crucial. Our favorite works of literature are ones that create in us a hunger for a world that only that book can satisfy. Every good reading experience is thus an escape. Since we have been conditioned to respond negatively to the idea of reading as escapist, I want to underscore this. C.S. Lewis has written with his usual good sense that all reading, whatever, is an escape. It involves a temporary transference of the mind from our actual surroundings to things merely imagined or conceived. This happens when we read history or science no less than when we read fictions. All such escape is from the same thing, immediate concrete actuality. The important question is what we escape to. Escape is not necessarily joined to escapism. The world-making of Dickens. Part of the genius of Dickens is his ability to create a world that compels our entrance into it and that we find enjoyable as we live in it. That world is, first of all, British. In fact, I know of no better introduction to the land, weather, and temperament of England than Great Expectations. The novel is permeated with a strong sense of place, for example. Pip's hometown, modeled on the river town of Rochester in Kent, is the very epitome of small-town England. Half of the novel is set in London, which similarly comes alive in our imaginations. And as for the sense of British weather, a passage such as the following speaks for itself. It was a rimy morning and very damp. I had seen the damp lying on the outside of my little window, as if some goblin had been crying there all night and asking the window for a pocket handkerchief. Now I saw the damp lying on the bare hedges and spare grass. On every rail and gate, wet lay clammy, and the marsh mist was so thick that the wooden finger on the post directing people to our village was invisible to me until I was quite close under it. The physical properties of the world of the story are thoroughly British. All roads, and especially all railroads, run to London. The world of the story is small and provincial, just as the island country of England is. The village of the novel is replete with pub, inn, church, and town hall, as every British village is. The customs of the world of the story are equally British. Class consciousness is much in evidence. In one of the great comic scenes in the novel, the simple blacksmith Joe Gargery finds it virtually impossible to know how to relate to Pip when he visits the gentlemanly Pip in London. Joe chases his constantly falling hat when it periodically slides from its perch. For his part, Pip views the village where he grew up with contempt once he comes into money and becomes a member of the leisure class. The British formality, reserve, and love of privacy are also evident throughout the story. Pip learns virtually by accident that his friend Herbert Pocket is engaged. John Wemmick, the clerk of the criminal lawyer Mr. Jaggers, keeps his private and work worlds totally separate. As he walks to work and progressively leaves his house behind, he, quote, by degrees got drier and harder as he went along, and his mouth tightened into a post office again. The subtlety of humor in Great Expectations is also vintage British, as is the richness in eccentric characters. In short, one of the chief pleasures of Dickens' story is its ability to transport us to the world of 19th century England. Once transported to that delightful world, we are made to care about the destiny of the characters who inhabit it. Number 2, lost in a story, the pleasures of plot. I have time to give you only a list of the topics that make up this subject. Novelist E.M. Forster said memorably that a story can have only one merit, that of making the audience want to know what happens next. By what means does a storyteller make us want to know what happens next? A memorable cast of characters, an engaging central character, heroes and heroism, villains and villainy. External action, but balanced by excursions into what is happening inside characters' minds and emotions. The presence of characters who are foils to each other. Back and forth rhythm between the familiar and the strange. That's kind of the inevitable rhythm of a plot, I would propose. We swing back and forth between the familiar and the strange. The pleasures of the plot include adventure, surprise, suspense, dramatic irony, rescue, reunion, recognition scenes. Readers through the centuries have warmed to stories of romantic love, and they definitely want the pleasures of a happy ending. You may know that Dickens was virtually forced to rewrite the ending of Great Expectations to give it a happy ending. Well, my summary statement is Great Expectations includes virtually all of the ingredients and motifs of plot that the human race wants to see in a story. Number 3, the pleasures of characterization. At the simplest level, said T.S. Eliot, a story invites interest in its plot. At the next step up the ladder of sophistication, according to Eliot, a story engages our interest with its characterization. The characters we meet in literature are one of the chief pleasures that we derive from literature. Dickens, as everyone knows, is famous for his powers of characterization. What do we mean when we praise a writer for the ability to portray character? My anatomy is as follows. Universal characters. Writers known for their character creations possess the ability to portray universal character types. When we meet such people in literature, we at once feel that we have also met them in life. The element of recognition is high. These characters are already part of our circle of acquaintances. Pip, for example, begins the story as the archetypal child. His longings and fears are instantly recognizable. We ourselves have known them. His childish miscalculations are equally familiar, as when he irrationally concludes that Uncle Pumblechook must be a happy man because he has so many drawers in his seed store. Later, Pip becomes the indolent teenager, and still later, the adult chastened by suffering, the person for whom life has been disillusioning and tragic, but somehow dear. Other characters are equally recognizable. Joe Gargery's wife is the shrewish wife and tormenting older sister. Biddy is the girl next door, the person of wisdom and virtue, but unnoticed because she lacks sparkle. Pumblechook is the archetypal windbag. Mrs. Coiler is the smothering flatterer. Estella is the coquette or flirt or tease. The pocket children who, quote, "we're not growing up or being brought up, but we're tumbling up," are the typical undisciplined children who can be found in anyone's neighborhood or home church. Herbert Pocket is the naive optimist, the person who, quote, "having already made his fortune in his own mind, acted as though it were an accomplished fact." Trabb's boy is the jealous mocker, and Miss Havisham, the reclusive spinster. Pip's life of rising and falling fortunes is strewn with what we call fair-weather friends. Orlick, like a certain strain of student, quote, "never seemed to come to his work on purpose, but would slouch in as if by mere accident." A not unknown student type. Universal characters, unique characters. Balancing these universal characters are the unique characters that we encounter only in literature. Here the appeal is not the familiarity, but the strangeness of the person. Miss Havisham is an example. She may belong to a recognizable type, the recluse, but where in real life have we met anyone who fits that type in this form? She stopped her clocks at 20 minutes to 9 of her scheduled wedding day. She has barricaded herself in her decaying house ever since, wearing her wedding dress to keep the memory of her ill-fated wedding day alive. The wedding cake is still on the table and features, I quote, "speckle-legged spiders with blotchy bodies running home to it and running out from it." Other characters also stand out from the pages of Great Expectations, resplendent in their eccentricity and idiosyncrasies. An example is Mr. Jagger's routine of washing his hands, and in particularly extreme cases gargling as well, to rid himself of the taint of his criminal clients. Wemmick, the clerk, lives by the motto that every person's purpose in life is to get his or her hands on, quote, "portable property," meaning money. Wemmick lives life in a castle-like house without parallel in the annals of life or literature. Clara Barley's father, old Graffengrim, stays in our memory as the one who growls and pounds as he paces the floor overhead. Magwitch, the generous convict, is himself unique. Sheer vividness in description can make a character come alive with unique individuality. The opening description of Pumblechook is a classic. I quote, "a large, hard-breathing, middle-aged, slow man with a mouth like a fish, dull, staring eyes, and sandy hair standing upright on his head, so that he looked as if he had just been all but choked and had that moment come to. Sometimes the speech pattern associated with a character makes the character distinctive. Sometimes the speech pattern does it. Dickens was so captivated by Joe Gargery that he created a new vocabulary and syntax for him. Number 3, characters who elicit reader involvement. Storytelling is an affective art in which storytellers manipulate our sympathies and aversions. This is most evident in the attitudes that a writer induces toward characters. We have a predictable sympathy for the underdog, for example. This is why we identify so strongly with Pip in the opening and closing phases of the story. Villains are equally effective in activating a reader. Thus, we react strongly to Drummle, Orlick, and Compasson. We also like attractive or exemplary characters who fulfill our ideals. And the simple but virtuous Joe Gargery is accordingly one of our favorite characters in the story. Writers who are known for their character portrayal are usually satirists, adept at portraits that make us laugh at characters' foibles or loathe them for their vices. Many of Dickens' characters are satirically exposed, usually in the laughing mode, but sometimes in a more scathing way. Summary of my remarks on characterization. Our favorite stories do more than excite us with fast-moving plot that makes us want to know what happens next. They also absorb us in the characters who perform the actions. It is the characters who give depth and substance to the events that occur. Number 4, the enjoyment of technique. In the Lone Book of Literary Theory that C.S. Lewis wrote, he suggested that we can judge books by how readers read them. Some books ask to be read only to find out what happens. Others invite us to enter a whole world of the imagination and enjoy its features, including its characters. Books that display superior technique go beyond even this and allow us to relish not only what is portrayed, but how it is portrayed. Lewis comments, again I quote, "Every episode, explanation, description, dialogue, ideally every sentence, must be pleasurable and interesting for its own sake." The comic genius of Dickens. An important avenue by which we can enjoy the how of Dickens' performance is the comedy of great expectations. In the first half of the book, Dickens consistently regales us with his humor, while in the second half of the story, the comic element virtually drops out of sight. The story is filled with moments of situation comedy. The fight between Pip and Herbert Pocket in Miss Havisham's garden is an example, as Herbert puts on an elaborate show with his preparations for the fight, but is easily defeated by Pip. In fact, 2 punches like that, and Herbert throws up the sponge that he has prepared, part of his elaborate preparations, and says, "You win then." All right, that was the fight. Its sequel, when the two recognize each other at the door of the apartment that they will share in London, is equally hilarious. Herbert, who was so easily defeated, looks at Pip and says, in effect, "Oh, I'm so sorry that I knocked you about the way I did." Other typical specimens include the mockery that Trabb's boy inflicts on Pip when the latter returns to the village in all his splendor, the scene in which Drummle and Pip stand elbowing each other in front of the fireplace at the Blue Boar Hotel, and the initial visit of Pip to the mismanaged Pocket household. Comedy arising from character also greets us at every turn. Wemmick's obsession with portable property and his eccentric domestic life are richly comic. So is the inconsistency involved when Mr. Pocket, father of a family in shambles, goes about lecturing as an expert on family management. Pip is held up to satiric ridicule during the middle phase of the story, as when he devises elaborate rituals of self-deception on evenings when he and Herbert tally up their debts. Beauty of style. Another feature of Great Expectations that makes us delight in how the story is told is the beauty of Dickens' language. A literary critic rightly speaks of the sheer beauty of much of the book. Novelist Graham Greene praised the novel for its delicate and exact poetic cadences. Dickens' way with words also accounts for much of the humor of the book. Consider the description of what Pip observes on a visit to Wemmick's house during the era when Wemmick is courting Miss Skiffins. As Wemmick and Miss Skiffins sat side by side, I observed a slow and gradual elongation of Mr. Wemmick's mouth, powerfully suggestive of his slowly and gradually stealing his arm around Miss Giffen's waist. In the course of time, I saw his hand appear on the other side of Miss Giffen's, but at that moment, Miss Giffens neatly stopped him with the green glove, unwound his arm again as if it were an article of dress, and with the greatest deliberation laid it on the table before her. Miss Giffen's composure while she did this was one of the most remarkable sights I had ever seen. Taking the table to represent the path of virtue, I am justified in stating that during the whole of the aged's reading, Wemmick's arm was straying from the path of virtue and being recalled to it by Miss Giffens. The subtlety of Dickens' humor is achieved by stylistic means. He is a master of understatement, for example. On Pip's first meeting with Miss Giffens, he, quote, judged her to be possessed of portable property. Your sister is given to government, Dickens makes Joe Gargery say to the youthful Pip. Overstatement is equally a part of Dickens' style. Pip mocks himself for his self-deception when he tallied up his overspending by claiming, I established with myself on these occasions the reputation of a first-rate man of business, prompt, decisive, energetic, clear, cool-headed. The descriptions of Dickens are a continuous fountain of delight. Again, it is in his inventiveness with words that works the magic. Quote, a cold, silvery mist had veiled the afternoon, and the moon was not yet up to scatter it, but the stars were shining beyond the mist, and the moon was coming. With linguistic feats like this, Dickens can make ordinary experiences unforgettable. When, for example, has a breakfast roll ever had the following degree of immortality conferred upon it? Mr. Trabb had sliced his hot roll into 3 feather beds and was slipping butter in between the blankets and covering it up. The following is an example of Dickens' style at its best, and a description of Pip's return to hometown after his near-death coma in London. The June weather was delicious. The sky was blue. The larks were soaring high over the green corn. I thought all that countryside more beautiful and peaceful by far than I had ever known it to be yet. Many pleasant pictures of the life that I would lead there, and of the change for the better that would come over my character when I had a guiding spirit at my side, whose simple faith and clear home wisdom I had proved, beguiled my way. They awakened a tender emotion in me, for my heart was softened by my return, and such a change had come to pass that I felt like one who was toiling home barefoot from distant travel, and whose wanderings had lasted many years. Toiling home barefoot. Pip becomes a latter-day prodigal son, returning to true values. The guiding spirit is Biddy, who by this time has married Joe Gargery, so Pip is disappointed by the prospect. The last page of the novel is equally great. You have always held your place in my heart, I answered, and we were silent again until she spoke. I little thought, said Estella, that I should take leave of you in taking leave of this spot. I'm very glad to do so. Glad to part again, Estella? To me, parting is a painful thing. To me, the remembrance of our last parting has been ever mournful and painful. But you said to me, returned Estella very earnestly, God bless you, God forgive you. And if you could say that to me then, you will not hesitate to say that to me now. Now, when suffering has been stronger than all other teaching and has taught me to understand what your heart used to be, I have been bent and broken, but I hope into a better shape. Be as considerate and good to me as you were, and tell me we are friends. We are friends, said I, rising and bending over her as she rose from the bench. And we'll continue friends apart, said Estella. I took her hand in mine, and we went out of the ruined place. And as the morning mist had risen long ago when I first left the forge, so the evening mists were rising now, and in all the broad expanse of tranquil light they showed to me, I saw no shadow of another parting from her. So to sum up my final point, the pleasures of literature are heightened when we can read not only to find the story material and characterization that we like, but also to delight in the writer's flaunting of technique. Great Expectations makes the expression itself so enjoyable that we would read the book for how it expresses its content, even if we did not equally love the content. Thank you.